It begins in the quiet heart of Florence, the city long celebrated for its brilliance, its art, its marble domes rising like divine lanterns above the Arno. Yet in the winter of 1886, the very city that had been a cradle of enlightenment and beauty would play host to a story that seemed to claw its way out of shadow. The convent at the edge of Florence, unremarkable in its design, surrounded by olive trees and pale stone walls, carried within it a disturbance that even the most faithful could not fully explain. Those who lived nearby swore that when the bells ceased tolling at midnight, when even the birds in the cypress groves fell silent, strange voices began to stir inside those cloistered walls. The first testimony came from a novice, a girl of only 17, who claimed to hear her sisters whispering in the dark dormitory as though possessed by another mind. Their words, she insisted, were not Italian, nor Latin, nor any language she had ever heard in her brief education. They were ancient, jagged, rolling in cadence like hymns reversed. She told the abbess in hushed fear, expecting rebuke, but instead received only a command, pray harder, and sleep more soundly. The abbess herself, seasoned by decades of spiritual discipline, believed the girl's imagination had been inflamed by the strict fasts and endless hours of silence that marked convent life. And yet, within days, others began to murmur the same. When Florence in 1886 is remembered, it is a place of contradiction. The city thrived with artists, musicians, and writers, but also bore the weight of centuries of dogma. Science and rationalism had been seeping into its blood for generations, yet the convent remained untouched by such currents, clinging to rituals unbroken since the Middle Ages. In that cloister, time was supposed to stand still. Yet, as night after night the voices rose and fell in tones both foreign and unsettling, it seemed time itself had cracked open, allowing fragments of something long forgotten to seep through. Witnesses described the voices as layered, sometimes lilting as though in song, sometimes harsh like commands barked in a forgotten dialect. At first, these murmurs would last minutes before fading, leaving the convent silent again, save for the uneasy shifting of those who had overheard. Then came longer passages, entire phrases that no one could translate. The sisters began to write them down, shaky hands scrawling symbols and syllables across scraps of parchment. One phrase in particular recurred again and again, heard by different women on separate nights. The letters formed no word in any Italian dictionary, no prayer in the Latin breviary, no chant of Greek liturgy. It was as though a secret tongue had found refuge inside their mouths, awakening in them what had been buried for centuries. Accounts say the abbess at first refused to accept the possibility of the supernatural. She insisted the convent was under attack by fatigue, by overwork, by the fever of religious intensity. But as she herself passed the dormitory one night and heard the simultaneous intoning of 3 novices, none of whom woke when shaken, her own certainty began to unravel. She described it in her private notes as a sound both beautiful and dreadful, a harmony of voices too perfectly aligned to be coincidence. And yet, when morning arrived, the 3 girls swore they remembered nothing but dreams of endless corridors and faces that did not belong to the living. It was during these early days that Florence outside the convent remained blissfully unaware. Carriages rolled along cobbled streets, markets filled with color and sound, and cafes buzzed with political debates. But within the convent walls, the women spoke of dread that pressed against their chests, a dread that could not be confessed to anyone beyond their cloister. To them, the voices seemed to belong to something vast and ancient, perhaps divine, perhaps demonic. And that tension, between salvation and damnation, between miracle and curse, marked the very beginning of the enigma. One sister began keeping a secret notebook. In it, she wrote every syllable she overheard, every strange consonant, every rolling vowel. Her ink strokes were uneven, her Latin comments frantic, as she tried to match the utterances to scripture. None fit. At last, one night, she recorded a passage that struck her as familiar. The words echoed faintly of an ancient psalm but were twisted, inverted, as though pulled from a mirror. She underlined it twice, and in the margin wrote, "Not from us." That notebook would survive beyond her lifetime, passed secretly, locked in drawers, and later whispered about by scholars who claimed it contained the earliest physical artifact of the voices. The section closes with the image of the convent cloaked in silence, its stone walls washed in pale moonlight, every shadow stretched long and uncertain. Yet within those walls, the nuns lay restless, half asleep, half entranced, while tongues they had never learned slipped from their lips. There was no audience, no congregation, no scholar to bear witness fully, only the sisters themselves. But those who survived would carry the memory like a weight, a secret burden heavier than their vows. And Florence, that city of light and reason, would soon learn that within its heart, the past had spoken, and no one could claim to understand what it said. Florence in 1886 was a city standing at a threshold, carrying within its streets the brilliance of its Renaissance past and the weight of a future rushing toward modernity. The city had once been the heartbeat of Europe's intellectual awakening, its marble cathedrals and frescoed chapels a testament to a civilization that believed beauty was a form of truth. By the late 19th century, however, the brilliance of Florence's golden age lived side by side with darker shadows, poverty in its alleys, superstition in its rural outskirts, and a church still wrestling with its waning authority in a world increasingly enchanted by science. This was the Florence in which the convent incident unfolded, and it is impossible to understand its resonance without first stepping into the city's atmosphere at the time. The air in Florence in those years was thick with debate. Coffeehouses hummed with conversations about Darwin, psychology, and the rapid advances in medicine. Students at the university were beginning to question the role of faith in understanding the human condition, while artisans and workers clung to older beliefs, refusing to let go of saints, relics, and whispered charms against misfortune. It was in this mixture of doubt and devotion that the convent sat, a silent fortress on the city's edge, belonging less to Florence of 1886 and more to Florence of centuries past. Its walls had heard centuries of prayers, its stones worn smooth by the knees of countless nuns in their daily devotions. To the modern Florentine, the convent was a relic of an older order, an institution still clinging to mystery and silence in an age beginning to demand evidence and proof. The convent itself was neither magnificent nor crumbling, but it was heavy with history. Built in the 15th century, it bore Gothic arches and narrow courtyards that caught the morning sun only briefly before retreating into shadows. Its gardens, filled with herbs and olive trees, provided not just food but medicine, as the sisters lived with little contact beyond their walls. Their days were marked by rhythm, the tolling of bells, the chanting of psalms, the quiet scratching of quills on parchment. Life inside was designed to be timeless, unchanging, immune to the pace of the world outside. Yet the same cloistered silence that was meant to draw them closer to the divine could also weigh heavily, pressing upon the mind until imagination and reality blurred. It is within this atmosphere of ritual repetition and isolation that the voices began. The city itself had seen mysteries before. Florence was no stranger to omens, prophecies, and signs. From the days when Savonarola's sermons sent crowds into frenzy, to more recent whispers of ghosts haunting the narrow alleys. Along the Arno, stories of the supernatural always found fertile ground. Yet 1886 was a year when Florence also prided itself on being rational. Its hospitals were experimenting with anesthesia, its scholars debated linguistics and history with vigor. To such a city, the notion of nuns speaking in forgotten tongues seemed both impossible and deeply unsettling. If true, it meant that Florence, the very city that prided itself on enlightenment, was still host to ancient forces that defied reason. For the sisters, however, there was little thought of Florence beyond the convent gates. Their world was small, enclosed, devoted to the rhythm of prayer and obedience. But the city's broader mood seeped in nonetheless. Letters from family spoke of politics, railways, and the modern march of progress. The younger novices were caught between the old and the new, their faith pressed against curiosity, their vows colliding with questions they could not voice aloud. It is in this inner conflict, between a world insisting on reason and a cloister insisting on silence, that the stage was set for the strange events of that winter. The convent's place in Florence was also symbolic. It stood near the hills, half withdrawn from the bustle of the city, neither fully part of urban life nor fully isolated like the mountain monasteries. It was a threshold, much like the era itself, a place where old worlds and new worlds touched but did not merge. That liminal position, half in the light of reason, half in the shadow of mystery, mirrors exactly what would later unfold within its walls. To the outside, it appeared calm, serene, unchanging. But inside, beneath the weight of centuries of ritual, something strange stirred, as though the convent had become a vessel for voices from a world older than Florence itself. Historical records show that Florence in those years was also obsessed with language. Scholars pored over Dante's texts, studied Etruscan fragments, and argued over the origins of Italian dialects. To such a culture, the sudden appearance of unknown tongues inside a convent would strike at the heart of identity. Was this divine revelation, or madness? Was it a lost root of Italian, a forgotten script of ancestors, or nothing more than meaningless sound? These were the questions that Florence would soon be forced to confront, though in 1886 the convent kept its silence, revealing little of what was happening behind its gates. The section closes by returning to the duality of Florence itself. Outside the convent, the city glowed with its usual life, gondolas on the Arno, scholars pacing in the Uffizi, bells ringing from the Duomo. Inside, however, the convent was becoming something else entirely. The contrast could not be sharper. The city prided itself on clarity, but the convent was about to plunge into obscurity. The city celebrated reason, but its sisters would soon be seized by voices that defied reason altogether. It is this contrast, between Florence as the birthplace of enlightenment and Florence as the host of an inexplicable mystery, that gives the story its lasting power. And it is here, in this tension, that the first true roots of dread began to settle, preparing the city for the whispers that would soon escape its walls. The first stirrings of the mystery came not in grand spectacle but in quiet hours when the convent was meant to be most at peace. The cloister, with its high walls and carefully ordered rhythms, was designed to suppress the turbulence of the outside world. Each day was the same, divided by the toll of bells, prayers before dawn, work in the garden or scriptorium, silence during meals, evening chants echoing in the chapel, then rest in the dormitories. It was a life meant to leave no room for distraction or temptation. Yet within these routines, strange disturbances crept, subtle at first, like hairline cracks appearing in stone long assumed unbreakable. It began with the novices, the youngest and least rooted in convent life. One girl claimed to have woken in the night to hear a fellow sister murmuring in her sleep. That was not unusual. Dreams often broke the silence of the dormitory. What chilled her was the nature of the words. They were not Italian, not Latin, not even the regional dialects she recognized from her village. They flowed quickly, carrying cadences unlike anything she had ever heard. The girl lay frozen, unable to rouse her neighbor, listening as the voice climbed and fell with a rhythm that seemed purposeful, like a prayer spoken from memory. By morning, she told the abbess, but was met with gentle dismissal. The abbess believed it the product of half-sleep and overexertion. Yet the seed had been planted, and soon others began to hear the same. Within weeks, more novices described similar events. Sisters who had never spoken to each other repeated identical fragments in the night, their lips forming words they could not understand, their bodies still as though in trance. At times, several voices overlapped, merging into a strange polyphony that made the hair rise on the arms of those listening. Some of the older nuns began to notice too, though they were reluctant to admit it aloud. To do so might suggest that the convent, consecrated for centuries, was no longer untouched by darker forces. Silence was easier than acknowledgement. But silence could not smother the unease that spread through the cloister. During meals, when the sisters sat together yet spoke no word, stolen glances passed between them. Each suspected the other, wondering who among them had become a vessel for strange utterances. The sacred chants in chapel, once steady and harmonious, now seemed haunted by memory. A hymn sung in Latin could suddenly sound too similar to the midnight whispers. The rhythm of the convent was unbroken in appearance, yet beneath the surface, fear grew like rot beneath polished wood. The abbess, determined to keep order, ordered longer prayers, more fasting, and stricter silence. She insisted the disturbances were nothing more than fatigue or temptation, challenges sent to test their devotion. But even she could not ignore the mounting reports. One night, compelled by unease, she walked the dormitory after midnight. What she witnessed became the first record of undeniable strangeness. Several novices lay in their beds, eyes closed, yet their lips moved in unison. The words poured out like water from a hidden spring, syllables that seemed to match one another, as though a choir had been summoned without intent. The abbess wrote later in a private note that the voices were harmonious, almost beautiful, yet she felt her blood run cold. For beauty in such a moment seemed unnatural, as though borrowed from another world. The impact on the sisters was profound. Some wept during confession, fearing they had been chosen as instruments of evil. Others whispered to one another in corners, daring to ask if this was not perhaps divine, some ancient tongue resurfacing, proof that God had touched their convent in ways beyond comprehension. The divide began to show itself between those who sought comfort in faith and those who began to crumble under fear. The shared life of the convent, meant to unite them, now became tinged with suspicion. Each woman felt herself either accuser or accused. One sister, more educated than most, began secretly to write down what she heard. Her notes attempted to capture the sounds, though her pen faltered often. She managed to record phrases she later compared with the Latin hymns of the breviary. Nothing matched, though she thought she recognized fragments of Greek endings, half-familiar cadences that teased her memory. She brought them to a visiting priest in hopes of guidance. He scolded her for presumption, telling her to abandon such curiosity and focus on obedience. Yet even he could not help but glance twice at the strange letters, as though something about them unsettled him too deeply to admit. The atmosphere of the convent shifted palpably. Corridors once filled only with the rustle of habits and soft footsteps now carried a different weight. At night, some sisters avoided the dormitory, preferring to keep vigil in the chapel, terrified of falling into slumber and becoming instruments themselves. Others forced themselves into exhaustion with prayer, believing that if they stayed awake long enough, the voices would pass them by. But fatigue only made the phenomenon worse, as the boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. Whispers that should have remained confined to sleep began to slip into waking hours. A sister, sewing in the refectory, suddenly muttered syllables under her breath before catching herself, her hands trembling. Another, reading aloud in Latin, suddenly shifted mid-sentence into a tongue none recognized, before fainting in fright. Word of the disturbances began to circulate quietly among the priests who served the convent, though no official report was made. To acknowledge it would invite scandal, and scandal would bring scrutiny from the wider church, something the abbess desperately wished to avoid. Yet the whispers could not be fully contained. Those who confessed to priests outside the convent let slip fragments of their fear. A few villagers in Florence began to murmur about strange happenings on the hill. At this early stage, however, it remained mostly within the walls. The section ends with a vivid scene, the convent at night, cloaked in silence, yet inside the dormitory, a sudden chorus arises. The sisters lie motionless, yet their mouths open in tandem, syllables flowing like an ancient river whose source no one can trace. One novice wakes in terror, covering her ears, while the abbess kneels alone in her chamber, whispering desperate prayers that cannot drown out the sound. The first whispers had begun, and the cloister's illusion of unbroken serenity was gone forever. As the days turned to weeks, the strange voices no longer confined themselves to fleeting moments in the dead of night. What had begun as murmurs heard in dreams now spilled into waking hours, and the convent could no longer ignore the reality that something was unraveling within its walls. The episodes became longer, more elaborate, and increasingly difficult to dismiss as exhaustion or mere imagination. Some of the nuns began to describe sensations of being pulled into trances, their thoughts slipping away even as words not their own flowed from their mouths. For others, it came as sudden bursts, fragments of speech that emerged unbidden and then left them trembling with confusion and fear. The accounts recorded from this time describe the voices with unsettling consistency. They were not babbling nonsense, not incoherent sounds as one might expect from a dreamer, but phrases with rhythm, grammar, and tone, as though spoken with intent. On several occasions, multiple sisters fell into the same trance simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a harmony so precise it seemed orchestrated. A visiting priest once wrote that the sound struck him with both awe and dread, for it was too ordered to be dismissed as madness yet too alien to be comfortably explained. The convent had become a stage for something neither divine nor fully human, a place where the line between worship and fear was collapsing. The psychological toll grew sharper with each passing day. Some of the younger sisters grew afraid of sleep, dreading the moment when their mouths might betray them again. They clutched rosaries with white-knuckled hands, whispering Ave Marias until dawn, their voices hoarse and broken. Others became withdrawn, refusing meals, staring at the floor as though hiding from something only they could see. A few began scratching at their own skin during the episodes, their nails leaving raw marks on their arms and faces. The abbess herself, once steadfast and authoritative, was seen pacing the halls at night, her candle shaking in her hand as the voices echoed faintly from the dormitory. The convent divided into two camps. One group believed fervently that what they were witnessing was a miracle. Perhaps, they argued, God had chosen them as vessels to speak in the tongues of angels, a gift echoing the Pentecostal fire of the apostles. These women claimed to feel a strange warmth in their chests during the episodes, as though embraced by something larger than themselves. They wept with joy afterward, convinced they had been touched by the divine. The other group, however, trembled in dread, believing the opposite, that the devil had wormed his way into their holy house. They pointed to the changes in behavior, the sudden violent seizures, the voices that sometimes dropped into tones too deep to belong to the women speaking them. They saw possession, not blessing, and whispered that they were being punished for hidden sins, perhaps even for Florence itself turning too far from God. The abbess tried desperately to maintain order, but she too was shaken by what she could not explain. During evening vespers, when the sisters gathered to chant their prayers, the voices sometimes broke into the liturgy, twisting familiar psalms into alien cadences. The effect was chilling. One moment the air was filled with the measured harmony of Latin chants, the next it was as if a shadow had entered their midst, bending the prayer into something unrecognizable. On one occasion, an entire chorus of nuns fell into a trance, their chanting shifting seamlessly from Latin into the unknown tongue, leaving the abbess alone, desperately trying to drag them back into the familiar rhythm. She described it later as standing against a tide that sought to swallow the chapel whole. The physical spaces of the convent began to feel transformed. Corridors seemed darker, the silence heavier, as if the very stones were listening. Some sisters refused to enter the dormitory where the voices were most common, begging instead to sleep on the cold floors of the chapel. Candles burned lower, their wax pooling into distorted shapes that the more fearful among them swore resembled ancient symbols. The air itself felt charged, as though storm clouds hung perpetually above the cloister, even on the sunniest of days. Florence bustled outside, but within, the convent seemed cut off from time, a self-contained world unraveling under the weight of its own mystery. There were reports of the voices taking on distinct personalities. A novice swore that one night she heard an older nun's lips moving, but the words were those of a child. High-pitched and sing-song, eerie in its innocence. Another time, a sister collapsed, and when she awoke, she claimed to have felt her voice forced into shapes by a will that was not her own. Others insisted the language shifted each time, resembling Latin one day, Greek the next, then dissolving into sounds no scholar could categorize. The impression grew that the convent had become a crossroads for voices beyond their own, fragments of lost tongues pressing against the thin walls of the present. The villagers began to whisper as rumors trickled out. Some said the sisters were possessed, that demons walked freely in the convent. Others suggested they were blessed, chosen to reveal hidden truths. Whatever the interpretation, the whispers made their way back to the convent, intensifying the paranoia. The sisters knew they were being watched, judged not only by one another but by the city that once ignored their existence. The convent was becoming infamous, even if the church tried to suppress all mention of it. The abbess, in her struggle to contain the crisis, began to enforce stricter discipline, but this only deepened the divisions. The more fearful sisters saw her severity as proof of divine wrath, while the hopeful saw their suffering as sanctification. In one incident, the abbess locked 3 women in the chapel overnight, believing their proximity to the altar would drive away whatever plagued them. Instead, the voices rose louder than ever, echoing through the entire convent, until even the most skeptical among them knelt trembling, their confidence broken. The sense of dread grew unbearable. Days passed under a constant cloud of unease, every shadow suspected of hiding something, every silence waiting to be broken by the unearthly murmurs. And yet, amid this terror, there was also fascination. A few sisters confessed they longed to hear the voices again, to feel that strange warmth, that borrowed language flowing through them. It was as if the convent itself had become addicted to its own haunting, unable to turn away from the mystery even as it consumed them. By the close of that winter, the convent was no longer the place it had once been. The prayers and routines remained, but they had become hollow, overtaken by the fear of when the next voice would rise. The language of shadows, as one scholar later called it, had settled into the very heart of the cloister. It was no longer merely a disturbance, it had become the defining reality of their lives, a force that no one inside or outside could claim to understand. The sisters moved like ghosts through their daily duties, haunted not only by what they had heard but by what it might mean. They were caught between light and shadow, faith and fear, their voices not entirely their own. And Florence itself, though unaware of the full depth of the events, was on the brink of learning that its most sacred spaces could harbor mysteries as dark as any legend whispered in its streets. By the early months of 1886, the strange events within the convent no longer remained entirely contained behind its thick stone walls. Florence, ever hungry for rumor, began to catch fragments of the story carried on the lips of villagers, servants, and even visiting priests who dared whisper of what they had seen. The convent, which had once been a quiet and nearly forgotten institution, now found itself at the center of speculation. Whispers that had once belonged only to the cloister now flowed into the city's streets, mixing with the life of Florence in ways the sisters could neither control nor ignore. The first leaks came from confessionals. A few nuns, unable to carry the burden alone, confided in priests beyond the convent, their trembling voices describing the nights of chanting and the strange trances that left them weakened. The priests, bound by duty to keep silence, nonetheless shared their concerns with colleagues, and soon the matter became known among Florence's clergy. Opinions divided quickly. Some insisted it was demonic interference, a spiritual trial that required stricter discipline. Others argued it was hysteria, the product of isolation and unhealthy routines forced upon women who had little contact with the outside world. A few, however, wondered whether something far older was resurfacing, something that could not be dismissed so easily. As whispers passed from mouth to mouth, the story changed shape. Among the villagers living near the convent, it became a tale of curses. Some claimed the nuns had uncovered a relic buried in the gardens, perhaps bones from a plague victim or an object best left untouched. Others swore that the sisters had angered God by harboring secret sins, and the voices were a punishment, a warning to Florence that it had turned too far toward modernity. Housewives repeated these stories in markets, weaving them into the everyday chatter of bread, wine, and weather, until the convent's name became synonymous with something uncanny. Florence itself was divided in its response. The intellectual elite, many of whom prided themselves on reason and skepticism, scoffed at the rumors. In cafes and salons, professors mocked the idea of supernatural tongues, arguing instead for collective delusion or exaggerated imagination. They suggested that the strict silence imposed on the nuns, coupled with fasting and long hours of prayer, could easily induce trance states. They spoke of the subconscious mind, a subject of increasing fascination in Europe at the time, suggesting that the women were drawing on hidden memories of languages they had glimpsed in scripture or hymnals. Yet even as they mocked, a few grew curious. Linguists and historians, obsessed with the origins of language, whispered privately that if such reports were true, it could reveal fragments of forgotten dialects lost to time. Meanwhile, the church sought to keep control. Local bishops ordered silence, warning priests not to spread gossip that could bring scandal to the diocese. Officially, the convent was untouched, its nuns as devout and peaceful as any in Italy. But beneath that official mask, measures were being taken. Priests were sent discreetly to observe, to listen, and to determine whether the phenomenon could be exorcised or suppressed. Their reports, though carefully guarded, hinted at events they could not explain. One priest described entering the chapel during Vespers and hearing the voices rise, echoing through the vaulted space in a tongue he did not know. He later confessed in private correspondence that the sound filled him with both terror and reverence, as though he had been standing at the edge of revelation. The convent servants also carried tales into Florence. Laundresses whispered of garments stiff with blood from self-inflicted scratches. Gardeners swore they heard chanting through closed windows, long after midnight. Even merchants, delivering bread and wine, claimed to glimpse pale faces staring from behind iron grills, their lips moving silently as though rehearsing hidden prayers. These fragments spread quickly through the city, passed along with exaggeration, each telling darker than the last. By spring, Florence buzzed with speculation. Some residents avoided the convent entirely, crossing the street rather than pass its gates. Others, drawn by morbid curiosity, lingered nearby at night, hoping to hear the unearthly sounds for themselves. What made the matter especially dangerous for the church was the clash between faith and modern inquiry. Florence was not some rural village easily controlled by doctrine, it was a city alive with scholars, poets, and skeptics. The idea that a convent of nuns could be speaking in forgotten languages challenged both sides of the cultural divide. For the faithful, it demanded explanation: was it miracle or possession? For the rationalists, it posed an uncomfortable problem: if the reports were false, why were so many witnesses convinced? If true, what did it mean for the boundaries of the human mind? The convent became, in whispers at least, a battleground between belief and reason. Tension deepened when a small group of scholars managed to obtain scraps of parchment on which some of the sisters had written the strange syllables they heard or spoke. These fragments, passed hand to hand, caused debate. One scholar insisted he saw echoes of ancient Greek, another claimed remnants of Aramaic, while still another argued they resembled nothing known, proof they were mere invention. None agreed, and the fragments vanished back into secrecy, perhaps confiscated by the church, perhaps hidden away by those who feared their implications. The mystery only grew more tantalizing. By late 1886, the whispers had taken on a life of their own. For some Florentines, the story was a source of dark fascination, a reminder that their city, so proud of its art and science, still harbored mysteries beyond comprehension. For others, it was a warning of corruption, a sign that even holy places were vulnerable to forces of madness or the devil himself. The convent, once anonymous, had become a silent landmark of unease, its walls carrying a reputation far heavier than their stones. Within the convent, the sisters felt the weight of this attention pressing in. Though they rarely left the grounds, they sensed the eyes of Florence upon them, heard the mutters of villagers, and felt the isolation deepen. The abbess tightened restrictions, forbidding all mention of the voices to outsiders, but the effort came too late. The story was no longer theirs to contain. The section closes with the image of Florence itself caught between two worlds, the bustling, modern city of light, science, and reason, and the shadowed convent where whispers in forgotten tongues unsettled even the most devout. In the streets, debate raged, but within the cloister, the women lived each day under the weight of a mystery they could not explain. The voices had escaped their walls, and now the city itself carried their echo. Florence, in its splendor and contradiction, had become part of the haunting, whether it wished to or not. As 1886 moved into its latter months, the convent's hidden affliction shifted from an uncanny phenomenon into something darker, more corrosive. What had begun as moments of trance and fragments of speech soon consumed the rhythm of daily life. The voices were no longer confined to the night, nor to the chapel, they emerged unpredictably, during meals, during prayer, even in the silence of the library. At first it had seemed manageable, a strangeness to be endured. Now it seeped into every corner of the convent, eroding the sisters' sense of safety. Those afflicted most strongly began to show signs of exhaustion, their bodies trembling under the strain of sleepless nights and uncontrollable outbursts. Their eyes grew hollow, ringed with deep shadows. They spoke less in their native Italian, as though their tongues were gradually being trained to other forms of speech. Some resisted, pressing their lips shut until they bled, but when their voices burst forth, it was with languages no one around them could place. This transformation frightened the others. The convent, once a refuge from the world, became an arena of dread where any sister might at any moment betray her humanity by uttering syllables that seemed carved from the abyss of time. The abbess, long a figure of stern guidance, struggled to maintain authority. She imposed harsher discipline, extended fasting, long vigils, forced silence, and penances designed to root out what she insisted must be temptation or possession. Yet these measures only deepened the atmosphere of fear. The nuns whispered among themselves that the abbess, too, had begun to tremble during prayers, her words faltering when the voices rose. Some claimed to see her lips move without sound, as though she fought against speaking aloud what haunted her thoughts. Her iron command weakened. The psychological toll was swift. Sisters who had once walked the cloister garden reciting psalms now avoided one another, glancing nervously as if waiting for their companions to slip into an alien trance. Meals were taken in uneasy silence, punctuated by sudden cries or streams of unfamiliar syllables. When this happened, others would shove back their chairs, covering their ears, sometimes weeping openly. Bonds of sisterhood that had once been unshakable fractured. Fear made them suspicious. Who had truly surrendered to God, and who had surrendered to something else? The convent itself reflected the disintegration. Corridors that had always felt serene became oppressive, their shadows lengthening, their silence thick. Doors creaked in ways that startled even the most devout. At night, the dormitories were filled with restless shifting, muttered prayers, or cries muffled by pillows. Some sisters began sleeping in the chapel, desperate to remain close to the altar as though the presence of sacred objects could protect them. Yet even there the voices intruded, rising like a tide that swept through the arches. The church's envoys, who had been sent quietly to observe, now found themselves overwhelmed. One report, never intended for public view, described a night in which several sisters fell simultaneously into trance during vespers. Their voices harmonized, though they spoke in differing tongues, weaving a polyphony that echoed with haunting beauty. The priest wrote that it felt less like madness than music, and yet it chilled his blood, for no human choir could have produced such unity in words none of them understood. He admitted he feared it was not of earthly origin, and confessed his dreams afterward were filled with fragments of the same sound. Within the convent, attempts to cope became desperate. Some sisters began writing the words they heard, filling scraps of parchment with jagged characters and half-formed letters. These writings, when compared, showed eerie consistency. Shapes that looked like ancient runes appeared again and again, though no one present had studied such things. Others took to flagellation, whipping themselves until their backs bled, in hopes of purging the affliction. Far from banishing it, the voices seemed to grow stronger, echoing even in the midst of pain. The youngest novices, unprepared for such terror, fared the worst. Several fell into hysteria, crying without pause or curling in corners, refusing food. One novice, only 17, was said to have clawed at her own skin, whispering that she wanted to escape the body that betrayed her by speaking what she did not wish to say. The elder nuns tried to comfort her, but many secretly feared she was right, that they were vessels for something that used them against their will. In such a place, mercy itself seemed powerless. As the months wore on, the psychological decay spread beyond individuals to infect the group's collective mind. Normal routines no longer anchored them. They lived in a perpetual twilight of dread, half waiting for the next eruption. A candle might gutter in the chapel, and the women would startle as though the flame itself carried meaning. A knock at the gate could provoke panic, for they feared outsiders might sense their corruption. Even the bells, tolling as they had for centuries, seemed to carry a different weight, their tones more mournful, as though the very air of Florence bent under the convent's anguish. It was during this period that darker interpretations flourished. Some nuns began whispering to each other that perhaps they were chosen, not cursed. That the voices were not demonic but divine, messages too ancient for human tongues, remnants of a lost paradise. This interpretation divided them further. Those clinging to orthodoxy condemned such thoughts as blasphemy. Yet others, weary of fear, embraced the idea that they were vessels for a forgotten revelation. The tension between these two factions created silent hostility, breaking the fragile unity of the community. Meanwhile, Florence outside grew restless with rumor. Families with daughters in the convent began petitioning for their removal, but the abbess resisted, fearing the scandal would grow uncontrollable. Instead, she forbade correspondence, locking the community further into its isolation. This decision deepened the sense of being trapped. The walls, once symbols of devotion, now felt like prison bars behind which their torment only grew. The city beyond their gates might as well have been 1,000 miles away, though its whispers seeped in like cold air through cracks in stone. The culmination of this escalation came during the winter of 1886. On a particularly bitter night, snow dusting the convent's cloisters, several nuns gathered for midnight prayer. Witnesses described the moment as one of total collapse. The sisters, already thin from fasting, swayed as though in trance, and then, without warning, fell to their knees in unison, their voices rising in a torrent of languages no one present recognized. The sound shook the chapel. Candles extinguished themselves in the sudden rush of air. One nun later claimed she saw the crucifix above the altar tremble, as though struck by some unseen force. When the voices finally stopped, hours later, the women lay sprawled on the cold stone, as though dead. Some never rose again with clarity of mind, their gaze lost to some private abyss. The psychological damage was now irreversible. Whether possession, madness, or something else entirely, the sisters had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. They lived in fragments of themselves, haunted by voices that came from nowhere, divided by beliefs they could not reconcile, and watched by a city that both pitied and feared them. What had once been a convent of prayer was now a crucible of despair, its atmosphere thick with dread, its women slowly unraveling under the weight of a mystery they could neither expel nor accept. By the time winter melted into spring, the convent no longer resembled a sanctuary. It had become a place of collapse, spiritual, psychological, and human. The escalation had consumed everything: discipline, sisterhood, faith, reason. All that remained was the endless anticipation of the next voice, the next collapse, the next inexplicable eruption from the depths of history itself. Florence looked on from outside, but within those walls, the nuns lived each day as though they were walking at the edge of an abyss, waiting for the final plunge. As the convent descended deeper into chaos, explanations became both a desperate need and a dangerous pursuit. For the Church, silence had been the safest response, but silence no longer sufficed. The phenomenon had grown too loud, too persistent, and too visible. With the sisters deteriorating, bishops and priests sought frameworks to understand what was happening, hoping either to contain the scandal or to purge the threat entirely. Science, faith, and folklore all attempted to seize the mystery, each producing theories that revealed more about their own limitations than about the truth. The earliest and most predictable explanation was demonic possession. Several priests, drawing from centuries of doctrine, declared that the nuns were under siege from infernal forces. Their solution was exorcism, and in hushed secrecy, rituals were attempted. Witnesses described scenes of almost unbearable tension, the afflicted sisters restrained as prayers and holy water were invoked, the air thick with incense and fear. Yet the results were inconclusive. At times the voices ceased briefly, only to return with greater force. One priest admitted afterward that when he pressed a crucifix to a nun's forehead, she spoke in a language he could not identify, yet her tone carried no hatred or defiance. Instead, it was mournful, almost reverent, as though she were reciting a prayer from a time forgotten. Such moments troubled the clergy deeply, for they did not conform to the usual signs of possession. Other churchmen sought subtler explanations. Some argued that the convent's isolation had produced collective hysteria. In the medical discourse of the time, hysteria was a favored diagnosis for women who exhibited unexplained symptoms. Doctors who managed to gain entry into the convent examined several sisters, noting their trembling hands, rapid breathing, and haunted eyes. They concluded that fasting, confinement, and constant prayer had induced altered states of consciousness. These physicians wrote reports suggesting that the foreign tongues were not supernatural at all, but fragments of biblical Greek or Latin dredged from half-learned scripture. Yet this theory collapsed when scholars who studied the written fragments could not match them to known languages with consistency. The growing field of psychology also entered the discussion. A few intellectuals in Florence, inspired by new European studies of the subconscious, argued that the nuns were revealing the hidden architecture of the human mind. They posited that within memory and instinct lay residues of ancestral speech, words passed down not through learning but through blood. If this were true, the convent might represent not madness but revelation, the unlocking of voices carried across centuries. This idea captivated some scholars, though it horrified church officials, who feared such theories stripped the phenomenon of its spiritual dimensions. The notion that the women were vessels of humanity's forgotten tongue threatened both theology and reason alike. Folklore, too, offered its interpretations. In villages surrounding Florence, stories flourished that the convent had been built upon cursed ground. Some whispered that beneath its foundations lay remnants of a pagan temple, and the voices belonged not to demons but to the gods once worshipped there. Others recalled older tales of the speech of the dead, a belief that spirits of plague victims or restless souls could speak through the living, using their bodies as conduits. Such explanations terrified the sisters most, for they were rooted in the idea that their convent, once sanctified, might itself be a place of haunting rather than protection. The abbess, desperate for resolution, permitted one final attempt at scholarly analysis. A linguist from Pisa, respected for his study of ancient manuscripts, was allowed into the convent under secrecy. He listened to the sisters during one of their trances and transcribed carefully. Later, he compared the words against his knowledge of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and even Etruscan. His conclusion was unsettling: while fragments resembled known languages, the structure defied all categorization. It was as though the speech belonged to a root language, older than history, from which others had branched. When he shared this idea with the church, he was rebuked, his notes confiscated, and his presence forbidden in the convent again. His name slipped quietly from records, though whispers persisted that he had gone mad afterward, muttering strange syllables until his death. Even as theories multiplied, they failed to explain the most chilling detail: the synchronization. Witnesses agreed that when several nuns spoke at once, their voices formed harmony, weaving together like strands of music. No matter what language they seemed to utter, the rhythm aligned, producing sounds that evoked awe as much as terror. This coherence suggested design, not delirium. It was this aspect that most unnerved observers, for it implied purpose. If the voices were invention, why did they blend so perfectly? If they were madness, why did they create beauty? The psychological impact of these failed explanations was profound. The sisters, subjected to exorcisms, examinations, and whispered debates about their sanity, grew more fragmented. Some clung desperately to the idea of possession, for it at least gave their suffering meaning within a known framework. Others embraced the notion that they were conduits of divine or ancient wisdom, a chosen group misunderstood by the world. Still others broke entirely, unable to reconcile any explanation with the torment they endured. Their fractured beliefs mirrored the fractured interpretations of those who studied them, leaving the convent suspended between too many realities, none of them offering peace. Florence, too, absorbed these theories, repeating them in distorted form. In markets and taverns, people argued whether the sisters were saints, lunatics, or witches. Mothers warned their daughters not to walk near the convent, lest they catch the disease of tongues. Men laughed nervously over wine, but avoided the convent at night. The city could not decide whether to scorn or fear, and so it lived in a state of uneasy fascination. The convent became less a holy site and more a symbol of the thin line between order and chaos, reason and mystery. By the end of these attempts, one truth had become undeniable: no single explanation satisfied. The priests failed to cast out demons. The doctors failed to diagnose hysteria. The scholars failed to categorize the language. The folklore failed to ease fear with stories. Each approach only deepened the mystery, leaving Florence and the convent alike in a state of unresolved tension. The sisters themselves were left with nothing but their lived experience, an experience no theory softened. They knew only the voices that rose unbidden from their throats, the exhaustion that hollowed their bodies, and the dread that stalked them with every breath. The effort to explain had brought no cure, no comfort, only greater isolation. And in that isolation, the mystery tightened its grip. The convent now stood as a site of unanswered questions, suspended between science and faith, madness and miracle. The attempts to explain had failed, and in their failure, the sisters' suffering had become more profound. The voices continued, steady and merciless, beyond the reach of reason, beyond the reach of ritual, beyond the reach of human comprehension. The search for explanation had not dispelled the darkness, it had only made its outlines clearer, sharper, more terrifying. The convent was no longer merely afflicted, it had become a mirror in which the limits of belief, knowledge, and humanity itself were reflected. And the voices, indifferent to all, continued to speak. By the spring of 1887, the convent no longer bore resemblance to the sanctuary it had once been. What had begun as fragments of strange speech had grown into a relentless burden that hollowed the lives of the women within its walls. The air itself seemed heavy, as though saturated with sorrow. The sisters, once bound together in prayer and obedience, now moved like shadows, each locked inside her own private torment. The convent had become a place of collapse, where silence carried as much terror as the voices, and where isolation itself pressed in like a physical weight. The abbess, who had long resisted admitting weakness, finally withdrew into her chambers for long stretches, emerging only to give brief orders or to attend Massachusetts. Her authority, though still formally intact, was no longer trusted. Some sisters claimed she had begun speaking in tongues herself during her solitude, while others swore she avoided the chapel entirely when the voices rose. With her absence, leadership fractured. Small groups formed, whispering in corners, each clinging to a different explanation of their plight. Some believed fervently they were cursed, others convinced they were chosen, but all shared the same hollowed eyes, the same restless fear that no explanation could protect them. The daily rhythms of the convent disintegrated. Meals, once taken together in solemn quiet, were often abandoned midway when one of the sisters slipped into trance, her words breaking the fragile calm. Gardening ceased as the women became too frail to tend the earth. The library, once a place of study, stood almost untouched, its shelves gathering dust while the women huddled in corridors, too wary of being alone. Even the chapel, which should have been their heart, felt desecrated by the voices that often erupted there in unison, leaving those present trembling and sick. Isolation deepened with every passing week. Letters were forbidden, visits restricted, and the city beyond seemed to vanish into dream. Yet the sisters could feel Florence pressing against their walls, the weight of curiosity and suspicion heavy in the air. They knew their suffering was not private, rumors swirled beyond their gates, making them subjects of fascination. This knowledge did not comfort them but trapped them further. They were spectacles without choosing, and the thought of the outside world watching their ruin made their isolation suffocating. Some sisters withdrew entirely into themselves, refusing to speak or even to eat. They moved like phantoms, their faces pale, their lips cracked from fasting. Others wandered the corridors muttering prayers, repeating the same words endlessly as though trying to build a wall of sound to block out the intruding voices. Nights were the worst. Sleep came only in fragments, and when it did, it was broken by cries that echoed from dormitories. More than once, the sisters awoke to find one among them missing, only to discover her kneeling alone in the freezing chapel, eyes fixed on the altar, whispering syllables no one dared interpret. The physical decline became undeniable. Bodies grew frail, ribs visible beneath their habits, fingers trembling from malnutrition. The youngest novices wasted fastest, their youth stripped by exhaustion and fear. Illness spread in the damp halls, but the sisters scarcely distinguished between sickness of body and sickness of spirit. For them, all suffering had blurred into one. To live within the convent was to live under constant siege by something nameless, and their strength, spiritual, physical, communal, was eroded piece by piece. Even the architecture seemed to conspire in their ruin. The cloister that had once brought peace now amplified the sound of strange voices, turning every echo into mockery. The windows, barred and high, let in light that felt cold rather than comforting. The walls, built for seclusion, now locked them away in their torment. The convent became its own tomb, stone pressing upon flesh, silence pressing upon mind. They were entombed alive in the very place meant to preserve their souls. It was in this state of collapse that the convent's isolation took on a final, absolute form. Attempts from outside, whether priests seeking to observe, scholars eager to analyze, or villagers demanding answers, were turned away. The abbess insisted it was necessary for their protection, but many whispered it was to shield the world from them, to keep their affliction from spreading. Locked away from contact, the sisters had only each other, and yet trust among them had eroded so thoroughly that companionship offered little solace. By summer, a kind of resignation settled in. The sisters no longer sought explanations, no longer resisted with fasting or penance, no longer pleaded for help from the church. They moved through their days in ritual motions, eating little, speaking less, waiting for voices that came whether they wished them or not. Their collapse was not dramatic but slow, steady, like the dripping of water hollowing stone. Each day was another layer of surrender, another strand of their humanity unwoven. The convent, which had stood as a symbol of devotion for centuries, was now only a place of isolation. To the city outside, it was a sealed mystery, a building that carried whispers but offered no answers. To those within, it was the end of their world. What had once been their chosen path of faith had become a labyrinth with no exit, a prison where the only companions were their own unraveling minds and the voices that rose from nowhere, speaking in tongues too old for anyone to name. In that isolation, the nuns ceased to be part of Florence at all. They became ghosts long before death claimed them, their lives collapsed into silence and whispers, their existence cut away from the world. The convent no longer protected them, it had devoured them, leaving only the faint echo of voices that refused to die. When the storm inside the convent finally ebbed, it did not end with an explanation or a miracle. It ended instead with exhaustion, with silence so heavy it seemed carved into stone. By late 1887, the voices that had once erupted daily became sporadic, weaker, as though the sisters themselves no longer had the strength to serve as their vessels. One by one, the afflicted fell into states of near catatonia. They no longer resisted, no longer wept, no longer prayed. They sat in corners, hands folded in laps, eyes unfocused, their lips only occasionally moving to whisper fragments of the tongues that had consumed them. What had once shaken the walls with force now dwindled to scattered murmurs, haunting in their fragility. The abbess, gaunt and weary, declared to the church that the worst had passed. But her words carried little conviction. Within the convent, collapse lingered in every breath. The sisters were shadows of themselves, skeletal from fasting and sleeplessness, broken from months of fear and division. The chapel that had once resounded with psalms now echoed with absence, its silence heavier than the voices had ever been. Death, when it came, seemed almost merciful. Several of the weakest sisters slipped away in their sleep, their passing noted without ceremony. The others watched in quiet detachment, as though grief itself had withered away. The church responded with efficiency and discretion. Records were sealed, priests instructed never to speak of what they had witnessed. Deaths were attributed to illness, exhaustion, or influenza, explanations the public found acceptable. The convent was placed under stricter supervision, though in truth there was little left to supervise. Of the dozens of sisters who had once filled its halls, only a fraction remained capable of participating in daily ritual. The others lingered in half-life, their faith shattered, their voices either silent or wandering into strange sounds none dared interpret. For Florence, the aftermath was not marked by revelation but by silence. The rumors that had once electrified the city gradually faded, not because people forgot, but because they chose not to remember. Fear made silence a survival strategy. Merchants who once gossiped about pale faces behind the grills now turned their eyes away when passing the convent. Servants who had once whispered stories of midnight chants no longer spoke of them, as though words themselves might summon what they wished buried. The convent remained, its walls unchanged, but the city treated it as though it had become invisible. It stood in plain sight, and yet no one wanted to acknowledge it. The silence did not erase unease. Parents still warned children not to linger near the gates. Some avoided walking past at night, convinced that if the wind carried just right, they might hear the remnants of the voices. Others insisted they had already heard them, faint echoes drifting into the streets, reminders that what had happened within had not entirely died. But such claims were quickly silenced with sharp rebukes or nervous laughter. Florence had chosen to forget, and those who remembered too vividly were left on the margins. For the survivors within the convent, aftermath was its own torment. They lived out their days in cloistered routine, reduced to motions without conviction. Some attempted to resume ordinary prayers, but the words of Scripture felt thin compared to the weight of the voices that had once overtaken them. Others sat in solitude, refusing to speak at all, as though guarding against the risk of their tongues betraying them again. A few clung to the idea that they had been chosen, but even they carried their belief quietly, as if ashamed to admit what once brought them awe now brought only isolation. Their world had narrowed to the convent walls, and within those walls lingered memories too heavy to name. Visitors to Florence in later years sometimes heard faint stories of the convent, half-whispered in taverns or among scholars with a taste for the obscure. A few foreign researchers even attempted to access the records, but the church's silence was unyielding. Documents had been sealed, testimonies buried. What remained were only fragments, an occasional letter smuggled from a priest, an inconsistent account in a private diary, or strange scraps of writing said to have come from the sisters themselves. These fragments tantalized but explained nothing. They hinted at a phenomenon that had brushed against the boundaries of human understanding and then retreated, leaving only ruin in its wake. The convent itself bore the weight of its past in silence. Its stones aged, its walls darkened, but no inscription marked what had transpired. Tourists admired its architecture without suspecting the horrors it had contained. Pilgrims knelt in its chapel without realizing the same space had once resounded with voices no scripture could explain. The building lived on, but those who entered rarely sensed its buried history. The silence was complete, enforced both by the church and by the collective will of Florence to move forward without looking back. Yet silence is not the same as forgetting. Among the older generation, the memory lingered like an unhealed wound. Mothers passed fragments of the tale to daughters, not as history but as warning: do not stray near, do not question too deeply, do not seek voices that are not meant to be heard. The story became folklore in whispers, losing detail but not weight. And in that folklore, the convent retained its shadow, even as the official record denied it. By the close of the decade, the convent was a place of absence, its legacy buried beneath silence. The voices had gone quiet, the city had moved on, and the church had locked the past away. Yet the ruin of the women within its walls remained. They lived not as martyrs or saints, but as broken remnants of a story the world refused to acknowledge. Their tragedy became invisible, their suffering absorbed by stone, their whispers carried only in the uneasy silence that clung to the convent long after the voices themselves had ceased. The aftermath was not resolution but erasure, a silence heavier than any sound. Florence continued to thrive, its streets alive with art and commerce, while within one corner of its heart stood a building that held a secret too heavy to tell. The nuns had been devoured by something no one could explain, and in the years that followed, the city chose to pretend it had never happened. But silence itself can be a haunting, and those who passed the convent at night often swore that, in the quietest hours, they felt watched, not by eyes, but by the weight of a history buried alive. In the years that followed, explanations surfaced like fragile attempts to impose order on chaos. Historians, theologians, linguists, and skeptics all reached toward the convent in Florence, each grasping for an interpretation that might finally silence the unease. Yet none could fully reconcile the strangeness of what had unfolded within those cloistered walls, and every theory seemed to unravel under its own weight. Still, they came, like echoes of the voices themselves, persistent, haunting, and unresolved. One of the earliest theories offered was medical. Some claimed the sisters had suffered from collective hysteria, a psychological illness fueled by the strictures of cloistered life. The isolation, the endless fasting, and the harsh discipline, combined with an undercurrent of suppressed desires and fears, could have created the perfect conditions for breakdown. Hysteria was a fashionable diagnosis in the 19th century, invoked to explain behaviors that defied comprehension. Doctors pointed to cases where women, often in groups, developed tremors, visions, or uncontrollable speech. In Florence, they argued, the convent had become a crucible of repression, and the voices that burst forth were simply the mind's rebellion. But even the most rational of physicians hesitated when confronted with reports of languages spoken with precision, languages the nuns had never been taught, some of them obscure tongues nearly lost to history. Could hysteria alone explain such fluency? The theory never fully satisfied. Others sought answers in the realm of faith. To some within the church, the voices were evidence of possession, a demonic infiltration sent to test the convent's devotion. They argued that the sisters, weakened by exhaustion and doubt, had opened themselves to forces beyond comprehension. Exorcisms, after all, had been attempted in those years, though none succeeded in silencing the phenomenon. The failure of holy rites only deepened the terror. If the voices were indeed demonic, why had the authority of the church failed to banish them? A darker possibility was whispered among clergy in private, perhaps these were not demons, but something older, something untouched by scripture, something the church itself could not name. But such notions could not be spoken publicly without undermining the very foundation of faith. Among scholars of language, the events of Florence became a curiosity bordering on obsession. Was it possible that the nuns had tapped into a deep reservoir of collective memory? Some suggested cryptomnesia, the idea that forgotten scraps of ancient texts, half-heard sermons, or fragments of old prayers resurfaced unconsciously, weaving themselves into the illusion of fluency. Others wondered if the voices might have been genuine glossolalia, tongues spoken not in earthly patterns but as ecstatic utterances, untranslatable and otherworldly. Yet when fragments of the recorded words were compared with ancient scripts, parallels emerged too exact to dismiss. Certain words matched forgotten dialects, certain cadences echoed liturgical chants not sung for centuries. How could cloistered women, unexposed to such knowledge, produce it with such accuracy? This question gnawed at every linguistic explanation. A stranger hypothesis arose from the fringes of spiritualism, which in the late 19th century was spreading rapidly through Europe. Mediums and mystics claimed the nuns had been conduits, their bodies channeling voices from the dead. To them, the convent had become a séance on an unthinkable scale, the walls themselves saturated with unseen presences. Some whispered that the sisters spoke for souls buried in Florence's soil, victims of plague or war, whose languages had long since vanished. Others claimed the voices belonged not to the dead but to something beyond time altogether, a glimpse into layers of reality humanity was never meant to hear. Though dismissed by science, these interpretations carried their own eerie resonance. There were also those who insisted the entire phenomenon was a fabrication. Perhaps the abbess had encouraged deception to secure attention or sympathy from the church. Perhaps the sisters, consciously or not, exaggerated their experiences, feeding off one another's fear until their lies became indistinguishable from truth. Skeptics noted the lack of surviving records, the deliberate silence of the Vatican, and argued that the story had grown in the telling, shaped by rumor more than fact. Yet even this explanation faltered, for those who had encountered the sisters firsthand described a horror too visceral, too raw, to be dismissed as mere play-acting. In the end, no theory resolved the riddle. Each explanation revealed as much as it concealed, leaving only fragments of understanding. The convent's silence became its final defense, its legacy protected not by truth but by the absence of it. What remained were whispers, of voices that had spoken in tongues no one could explain, of women consumed by something greater than themselves, of a church and a city that chose for getting over facing what had happened. And so the convent's mystery endured, not as a solved case, but as an open wound in history. To walk past its walls today is to stand before a story left deliberately unfinished. The voices may be gone, but the questions they raised still echo. Were they the cries of broken minds, the language of spirits, or the intrusion of forces older than faith itself? No answer suffices, and perhaps none ever will. The convent remains, stone and silent, its secret intact, its shadow lingering across centuries, reminding us that some mysteries are not meant to be explained but only endured. Even as Florence moved forward, adorning itself with modernity and progress, the shadow of the convent never entirely lifted. For those who lived near its walls, the building was not simply another relic of stone but an unspoken reminder that beneath the beauty of the city lay histories too strange to reconcile. By the final years of the 19th century, the events had slipped into a half-life of folklore, stories told in whispers, warnings passed between generations, and uneasy glances cast at the convent windows when twilight fell. The world beyond Florence had already begun to forget, yet within the city itself the legacy refused to die, haunting in subtler ways than screams or voices. Some of the oldest families in Florence still spoke of how the city's spiritual atmosphere had changed after the voices. Parishioners who once felt the church's protection as absolute now prayed with more uncertainty, aware that not even holy rites had silenced what had happened. For them, the convent stood as proof that evil, or something beyond human comprehension, could infiltrate even the most sacred spaces. That unease stretched into generations, so that children raised on cautionary tales grew into adults who never passed the convent without muttering a small prayer, just in case. Travelers from abroad occasionally rediscovered the story, usually in fragmentary notes tucked into private collections. A letter from a visiting priest describing the sound of languages long extinguished, or the diary of a scholar who swore he heard chanting in a dialect he could not identify. These fragments would ignite curiosity, but just as quickly they were extinguished by silence. When researchers attempted to question the church directly, they met only denials, polite dismissals, or vague acknowledgments that the sisters suffered an illness. The refusal to confirm details only fed the legend, suggesting that the truth was more terrifying than any rumor. By the turn of the century, the convent was already more ghost story than fact. Guides in Florence avoided the subject when leading tourists, but street children whispered of strange shapes in its upper windows and claimed that if one lingered near its gates on a winter night, they might hear a faint chorus drifting on the wind. Skeptics scoffed, insisting such tales were born of imagination and fear, yet the persistence of the whispers gave them weight. It was not unusual for passing strangers to find themselves uneasy without knowing why, the silence of the place heavier than the noise of the city surrounding it. In later years, folklorists classified the convent story among the many European accounts of haunted religious houses, yet they noted its peculiar uniqueness. Unlike typical tales of apparitions or cursed relics, this one was anchored in documented phenomena, dozens of women, many educated and devout, simultaneously speaking tongues they had never learned. The folklorists argued that even stripped of the supernatural, the story retained its power because it blurred the line between faith and madness, science and mystery. It was less a ghost story than a cautionary riddle, proof that history can fracture into shadows that resist the light of explanation. For the surviving nuns who lived into the early 20th century, the legacy was more personal. Some never spoke of what had happened, burying the memories as if silence could undo them. Others carried their experiences as unshakable burdens, writing hesitant reflections in private journals that were rarely shared. A few found comfort in the belief that they had touched the divine, though their voices carried more sorrow than triumph. They died scattered, their lives marked not by sainthood or infamy but by an eerie anonymity, as though history itself conspired to erase them while keeping their suffering alive in rumor. Today, the convent remains, quiet and unassuming, folded into the fabric of Florence like any other historical building. Tourists admire its Renaissance lines without knowing what once stirred within. To the casual eye, it is ordinary, yet those who have studied its past describe a different sensation. They claim that stepping inside its courtyard, the air feels different, denser, as though carrying memories unwilling to fade. Some describe the silence as unnatural, a silence that hums with something withheld, as though the walls themselves remember. And perhaps they do. Perhaps stone has its own memory, one that outlives human words. If so, then the convent in Florence is not only a building but a vessel of echoes, carrying the weight of voices that refuse to die with their speakers. No theory, no record, no denial has been able to extinguish them entirely. They remain in the imagination of the city, in the tremor of folklore, in the uneasy pause of anyone who walks past after dark. That is the true legacy, not the voices themselves, but the silence they left behind, a silence that continues to speak. In the end, the convent is not remembered through official histories but through lingering echoes. It endures as a paradox, a place simultaneously forgotten and unforgettable, erased yet unforgettable, silenced yet still murmuring through generations. Florence may have chosen to bury the truth, but the ground beneath its stones still carries the shadow of a question too disturbing to answer. And until that question is faced, the convent will remain what it has always been, not just a house of prayer, but a house of mystery, where forgotten languages once spoke, and where silence itself became the loudest voice of all.